I'm Karen Smilowitz from Northwestern.
I'm Samantha Keppler from the University of Michigan.
Welcome to our tutorial on the use of operations research and operations management in public education. So Sam and I are coming to you from our homes on an October morning. Like all of you, we had planned to give this talk in November, and so we're going to try to make the tutorial as interactive as we can. It's going to be an hour of presentation followed by a Q&A time. And so what we'd like to do is try to make that initial hour as interactive as we can. So feel free during our presentations to put questions in the chat. We would love to be distracted from watching ourselves present, so please do that. If there's a question that you don't feel comfortable putting in the chat, we also have our emails here, so feel free to email us as well. So before we begin, we wanted to thank the reviewers on the tutorial for really pushing us to take our look at operations research and operations management in education in new directions. We also want to thank all of our partners at the public schools with which we've worked. We have a ton of collaborators at both of our universities who have also contributed significantly to this work.
So our tutorial covers about 60 years of OR and OM work in public education. And it cites papers and talks about research in all different areas, not just in the US, but around the globe. And so we have to, unfortunately, take a subset of that and focus on it for this particular presentation. But we encourage you to look at the paper and read about a lot more examples than what we're going to be able to talk about. And so the way we thought about what we could focus on here was we divided it between what we're calling the school access section, which is section 2 in the tutorial, which is really looking at court, when Karen's going to present this section and talk about the court motivated policies that inspired the operations work in this area. And then I'm going to talk about market reforms, which is kind of a different way that education policy happens as opposed to court reforms. And then we're going to end and come back together in a format similar to this to have a discussion, particularly about COVID and its effect on education. And we will go from there. So I'm going to turn it over now to Karen, who's going to start with section 2, school access.
Hello, welcome to the second part of our tutorial. I hope you're still with us. I'm going to talk about, in this presentation, the second section of our tutorial chapter, which is focused on access to schools. And so I was recently listening to a podcast that reminded me a lot of the work that we're doing in this area. And it was a podcast looking at schools in New York City. And there was this great quote about how schools are immune to long-term memory and that we tend to look forward instead of looking back. And I think as researchers, we often look back in terms of modeling or solution algorithms and building on the research of the past. But I thought what was really interesting in this tutorial is to look at the role of operations research within major policy decisions in the United States back in history and then bring it forward to where we are today. So while the chapter focuses on school access globally, I'm going to talk primarily about work done in the United States. And so for those of you who are less familiar with the court cases on desegregation in the United States, I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the key cases. And I will begin with Brown versus Board of Education, which is the landmark US Supreme Court decision that ruled that separate but equal facilities is unconstitutional. And so this was really aimed at what's known as de jure segregation. So segregation by law. So you can think about Jim Crow laws. These were explicit laws that limited the access to facilities such as schools by race. And so Brown versus Board of Education was the Supreme Court case that said you can't do that. Now, as you can imagine, this took quite a bit of time to actually go from a court case to actual progress in desegregating schools. And so the following court cases really address the issue of speed. And so what's known as Brown 2 is desegregate with all deliberate speed. Then came later cases, Green versus New Kent, Alexander versus Holmes County, that looked at desegregation now. And one of the challenges is that you can eliminate de jure segregation, but you're still facing de facto segregation. And de facto segregation in schools is segregation that results from other factors such as residential segregation, right? So the Jim Crow laws didn't just impact schools, but they impacted where you could live. And since school assignment in the United States is primarily driven by neighborhoods, if your neighborhoods are segregated, then your schools are segregated. And so a number of mechanisms were introduced to move students, transport students around to create desegregated schools. And one way that was commonly done is school busing. And this is where, as you can imagine, the operations research community was heavily involved. And so a case that you will see mentioned in some of these early papers is Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg that looks at busing to promote integration. So you talked about what was happening in the 50s and 60s in terms of the court cases. And I want to take you back to what was happening in operations research in the 50s and 60s. And so for someone like me who's interested in transportation and logistics, this was an important time because that's when the transportation problem was introduced, and also very efficient methods for solving the transportation problem were introduced. So this is the work by Danzig and Ford and Fulkerson. So the transportation problem, which I'm sure you remember back to your intro OR courses, is you have a set of sources with supplies and you have a set of destinations with demand. And the transportation problem looks at the cost of going from source I to destination J and looks to, as you can see in the objective function, to minimize the cost of the items flowing between. Now, these items are non-negative continuous variables. So in the 50s and 60s, there were very efficient methods to solve these problems. There are constraints on limiting supply as to what you have at a source and making sure that you meet all of the demand. Now, the other problem that I want to introduce you to is the political districting problem by Hess and Weaver in 1965. So just as there was movement in desegregating schools at this time, there was also movement in many other ways. And so a lot of political district lines were being redrawn. And the Hess and Weaver work looks at how do you think about, so if you think about the subjective function in transportation, how do you think about creating regions that are now politically more compact? And so rather than looking at distance, you look at distance squared, and this is going to play a role in the school district doing work as well. So as you can imagine, thinking about the transportation problem to move items from supply to demand and the political districting to create districts that are compact naturally led operations researchers to think about the applications of these problems to school redistricting. And so that's when the school redistricting problem emerged, which was defined as a capacity feasible assignment of students to schools. So when we think about sources of students, we now think about a geographic region where students live. Now, because of computational limitations at the time, these regions were quite large. So you can think of a tract as being a fairly large neighborhood within a city. And the destinations would then become the schools. Now, when we think about students, because this work was focused on desegregation of schools, you'll see particularly the early models look at these flow variables in terms of students from I to J of race K. And so our flow variables are now student assignments. So there was a fair amount of work that started coming out. The first two papers that I've listed here are more conceptual, going through kind of what I just talked about in terms of transforming a transportation problem into a school redistricting problem. The next two papers, I've highlighted specifically in purple the school districts with which they worked. This is important because back in the 60s, it was important to get computer time to run some of these models, and that cost money. And so when researchers were working with school districts, they were able to get adequate time to run the models. And I compare that to Franklin and Königsberg, which I'll talk about in depth in a little bit, where the researchers were working on behalf of the families and their resources were limited. And I'll talk about how that impacted their approach. So I want to go back to that first paper that I cited, Clark and Circus, which later researchers refer to as the kernel problem. And this is where you first see the transportation problem converted into a school redistricting problem. So the objective function is similar. So you see minimize the distance to schools, but now you'll also see that this is summed over the different subpopulations of students. Capacity is the same. This is the capacity of the school. Assignments are the same to assign all of the students. Now, what's different and what starts to add complexity to the problem from the transportation problem is racial balance constraints. And so you can think about this with the figure on the right. So what is happening around the time is when we think about segregation, there were segregation indices that were appearing in the literature at the time to look at, if you think about a city as a whole and the racial diversity of the city, how segregated a city is if you looked at sub regions of that city. So it could be a neighborhood or it could be a school. Does the diversity of the neighborhood or school look like the diversity of the community or the city as a whole? And so the purple line here is when you have a perfect balance at every school, when the racial diversity at a school represents the city as a whole. Now, what you tended to see more often is this blue line, which is either the racial segregation at the time or the school segregation. Since neighborhood schools were predominantly the way students were assigned to school, the curves are quite similar. And so these racial balance constraints were aiming at moving the blue up to the purple. And so the assignment of students to schools, there would be upper and lower bounds by the number of students to balance students by race. So in one of the paper in the early 90s reflecting on some of this early work, there's a really nice classification of the papers by how decision variables were defined. And a lot of this initially really is limited by computational power and what could be solved. And so this first paper that I talked about, and again, this is really just adapting the transportation problem to the school redistricting problem. And you see what's known as track splitting by race. So Xijk, and these are continuous variables. So again, easier to solve. So Heckman and Taylor, ultimately where you want to go is where students live, regardless of race, should dictate where they go to school. So track splitting by space comes up with the Xij variables. The challenge with this is, again, these tracks are very large. And so doing track splitting by race assumes that there's a uniform distribution of students by race across the tract, which is an assumption that often did not hold. In both of these methods, and even in the whole track assignment as well, these tracks are very large. And so a lot of work needs to be done afterwards in terms of post-processing, right? So if you have track splitting by race or by space, you know the number of students within an area that should go to a school, but determining which actual students is quite a bit of work. So Liggett in 73 is the first time that integer variables are used and these binary indicator variables. And I'll talk about where we are now in terms of solving these problems, and that is the way that it tends to be modeled. So the other thing that is classified in this 1991 paper is how the racial balance constraints are done. And so ideally you would be doing balance by assignment, which is not just setting a priori how many students of each race should be at a school based on the capacity of school, but you really want to look at how many students are actually in that school. So these balance on assignment will add decision variables to the right and left-hand sides of this constraint. So you can imagine this is, again, taking the problem, making it more complex as we go along in later versions of the problem. I want to talk in particular about the Franklin and Konigsberg paper and its connection to a case in Richmond, California. So this is in Northern California. So the case looked at Richmond Unified that was using a freedom of choice plan for desegregation. And so rather than redistricting, as you saw with these models, rather what they would do is give students and families the choice to move to a school. Now, in actuality, as you see here, only 7 of the 900 students who transferred to a less segregated school were white. And so the result of freedom of choice is that the schools were still very much segregated. And not only that, and this is the case at Verde Elementary, is that the newer schools tended to be predominantly white. And so Verde Elementary, which was 99% Black, the families there went to the courts and said, this is not adhering to the law in terms of desegregating schools. The district argued that moving from a neighborhood model where you were using busing for desegregation would put too much burden on the families and there'd be too far to travel. And so Franklin and Konigsberg, and Franklin in particular in the case, argued that no, there are feasible solutions to achieve racial balance and do this within the limits that the district had set on transportation. And so in their paper, they looked at 3 models. So the first model is just the standard transportation problem without racial balance constraints. And so in this model, it's assigning students to the closest school. So as you can imagine, and I'll show in a minute, the solution is going to fairly match the residential segregation at the time. So model 2 that takes model 1 and adds racial balance constraints and looks at grade level student assignment. Now, this is where I was talking about the importance of funding. So in particular in the paper, they talk about while other papers on behalf of school districts, there was funding to run the larger models. In this case, because they were acting on behalf of the families, the support wasn't there. And so what they did is what you see as model 3, which is a decomposition of the problem so that it's the resulting problem they were able to solve. So I want to talk you through some of the results of these models. So again, this purple line where you look at if the x-axis is the enrollment of Black students and the y-axis is non-Black students, you want to get close to this purple line where the school level diversity is equal to the district level diversity. You can see where the racial segregation was in Richmond, California at the time and the current school segregation. So not surprisingly, model 1, which had no racial balance constraints, is pretty close to the residential and current school segregation. Model 3 shows that still while minimizing distance and putting limits on how far students travel, gets you pretty close to the purple line. And so what this meant in the court case is that the plaintiffs were able to argue that there was a feasible solution to achieve racial balance and not change the basic idea of neighborhood schools. The court in general ruled that there was racial imbalance at the Verde School, which was in fact de jure, and therefore the school had to take affirmative action to eliminate this segregation. What's interesting is even if it's point 3, even if it had been de facto, it is still because of subsequent court cases, the burden is on the school district to come up with plans. And then you can see in point 6, which is what Franklin and Konigsberg put in italics, is that there are feasible solutions to do this. So this paper's from 73. Also around this time, you start to see, and this is a really interesting paper in management science that I encourage you to read, was looking about at the larger question of how researchers were modeling school desegregation. And the paper calls out the difference between desegregation and integration, right? So desegregation is a spatial concept. It is coming up with ways to allocate students to schools so that the resulting racial diversity of the school matches the community. Integration goes far beyond that. Integration is education as a whole. How well are you integrating the students in the schools that they're in beyond just coming up with a diverse school? Is it an integrated school? And so the other thing the paper does is it introduced me to the term Weltanschauung, and it's plural Weltanschauungen, which is a worldview. And so they looked at the OR papers at the time that were addressing school desegregation and school busing and kind of separated them into two groups. The papers that looked at it as a desegregation problem, so really looking at redistricting and transportation, minimizing costs to achieve racial balance, versus an integration problem, which takes a larger, more holistic look. And it's really interesting, I think, to look at some of the issues that we wrestle with now in operations research as we apply it to some of these very large societal issues and thinking about the limitations of modeling and how we need to go beyond that. And so they kind of look at this question of, are we solving the right problems? And if we're not solving the right problems, what happens to the resulting solutions? When those solutions get implemented, what is the responsibility of the researchers in terms of how these solutions impact society? And have we really addressed the question of what is a good solution? And this is certainly something that, you know, in our work with school districts now, we talk a lot about this idea of what is good? What does good look like to you in terms of a solution? And when they talk about, you know, how do you address these issues, this is really, I think, something that the Informs community has done a lot over the 60 years since, is really looking at how do we think more broadly about these problems? How do we bring in interdisciplinary teams? How do we think about implementation as part of the work we're doing? And really, how do we think of the history of all of this? And I think, you know, for me personally, just going back and reading these papers has been a really eye-opening delve into history. So The other thing that I think is really interesting is just to look at the reaction at the time from the operations research and operations management community. So one of the papers that is cited in Stinson and Thompson is a paper that looks at Oklahoma City schools. And so at the time, Oklahoma City schools, one of the proposals was a cluster plan. So the cluster plan looked at students would stay in their neighborhood school as their home school, but they would travel to other schools for specialties. So every homeschool would have some designated specialty. So the desegregation would happen in these transferring to other schools for their specialties. And so Keppler, in a response in management science to this original paper, said this is not simply a desegregation school, and it's looking at options beyond just bus transportation and thinking about good plans to desegregate schools, and it's kind of a harsh treatment on Stinson and Thompson, who then equally come back and say, well, you need to look further into what you're talking about, because in fact, that is not what's happening right now. And the cluster plan was rejected by the courts for a more traditional bus plan, kind of the models we talked about earlier. An interesting aside to this that is not, I'm suggesting at all connected to the ORMS work that was done, is that this course was not decided finally. It could have kept going on. So as I said, there was another plan that was put in place. And then at some point in the 80s, the school district said, well, now we've reached the racial balance we wanted, and we don't need to consider these federal laws anymore. And the court in the 90s, which was more conservative, there was another landmark case, Board of Education of Oklahoma City versus Dowell, that had the statement that federal supervision was intended as a temporary measure. And this case really paved the way. And again, I'm not saying this is because of the work, but it really paved the way for a pendulum shift in how school desegregation is done in the United States and the role of the federal government. And that kind of brings us to where we are now, where schools are still struggling. You know, a lot of these busing solutions put the burden of busing on Black students. And so when you think about school access, there's really a question of, is this equal access? Is it equitable access? Are we asking students of one race to travel much further than others to their schools? And I think this is something that you see a lot of schools grappling with. And so on the right here, you can see a map of Evanston, and you can see the boundaries that we're looking at when we think about assignment variables are far smaller than what we were talking about with tracks, which were much larger. And that's can be done because of the advantages in integer programming. Integer programming and advances in GIS have also allowed us to look at distance in a much more accurate way. We can look at school hazards in terms of whether or not students are bused to school. There's also a much better ways looking at network flows or these tasks or neighborhoods about looking at contiguity. So not just using distance squared to look at compact regions, but actually explicitly looking at the contiguity of the school regions. So what I'd like to talk about, and I think Sam and I will talk about this a bit when we, in the last part of our tutorial, is thinking about what has happened over these 60 years of school desegregation and what that means right now in terms of not only what our schools look like, but how that's impacted COVID and how families are able to provide, you know, access to school for their kids. And this quote really struck me because it's from 1968, looking at integration, but I think it's very relevant to the discussion that we'll have about COVID and schools. And so there's this line about, you know, if school, you know, why are schools carrying the brunt of desegregation and integration? And really, this is a bigger problem. And so when we return to COVID, I'd like to talk also about the burden of so much burden that's been placed on our public schools. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sam, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Hello. Thank you for sticking with us this long. So you just heard from Karen, who was talking about the more OR side of education operations. And I'm going to pick up kind of where she left off and talk about some more operations management and a little bit about why I think operations management research in the education space is kind of growing in relevance because of some of the things that are policy changes and reforms that have been happening. So the reason I'm going to use the US as an example, but I'm going to make the case in a second that this is actually something that's been going on worldwide. So in 2000, around the year 2000, a lot of reforms had started taking place in education that really introduced different market ideas to a public government-run education system. The first, and the most landmark, I suppose, was the No Child Left Behind Act, which basically introduced two ideas into the education space. One was test scores as the main outcome metric of education, and accountability, which means that schools that have low test scores are the ones that will be blamed for those low test scores. And so there's like no excuse for schools to have low test scores regardless of the students that they serve. And so this really increased the test performance pressure on schools. So this really parallels to some of the reforms in the 1980s in healthcare that really tried to change, like put the market forces on hospitals. This is putting market forces on schools. And then after that was school choice reform. So these are not federal policies in the US, these are state, even local reforms that have changed the way that parents choose schools for their children, instead of just what Karen was talking about, where there's school districts and students attend the school district school that they are assigned. Suddenly now parents have license to pick any school across an entire range, often an entire city, sometimes a smaller subset of schools, but there's a lot more choice amongst free public schools. And so that increased the competitive pressure. So schools not only are facing performance pressures, but competitive pressure to attract students. Again, another market force. And then came the Great Recession, or the 2008 recession, which really decreased the financial support for schools. So now they're facing this test performance pressure and competitive pressures, but with less money. Budgets were slashed around 25% in many states and districts. So now they're really trying to problem solve here of how to make sure that the school does not fail and ultimately get shut down, which was happening and still happens to this day when schools are underperforming. And then the more recent reform is the student-based budgeting, which is something that's happened not in every place across the United States, but there's a general trend in major cities anyway towards fiscal decentralization, which is that you're moving the financial decisions closer to the students. You're moving it closer to the schools in this case then. So instead of districts making decisions, schools are making decisions about exactly what types of programs that they want, who they want to hire. And so with this financial control comes a lot of interesting decisions and interplay between the schools and districts that I think give rise to a lot of interesting market forces that I think are relevant to operations management. And I'm not going to talk about COVID yet. Obviously, this timeline kind of has an interesting end, but we'll talk about that in the last segment. And so even though I use the US as an example, general reforms have been happening across the world that have really pushed on testing and marketplace in education. And so I mean, this is exemplified by the PISA exam, which was launched in the late 1990s, which is the exam that we refer to when we talk about rankings across countries and which countries are performing more or less highly on different standardized tests. And then I think there's just more global competition as well. So all of these things come together to basically say that there's these market forces. And so from those changes came a new stream of interesting operations problems or research to solve these problems. And this is not to say that the transportation problems, they're embedded in here, the districting problems are embedded in here. All these things are embedded, but these are kind of like the 2.0 versions that come from these market reforms. And so the first one is how can we help districts design more effective, efficient, and equitable ways to assign students to schools? The second area is in district level support tools. How can we help districts make more cost-effective and equitable decisions at the intersection of school choice and transportation? And then the last area is school service contracts. So how can we help schools increase enrollment through effective contracts with nonprofits and public agencies? So these three buckets of research came as a result of market reforms, and I'm going to talk about one or in the case of mechanism design, 2 papers in each area, and just kind of highlight these as examples of what the type of research is in these areas, and then kind of close with what are the similarities and differences across these different research areas, and then what are the opportunities. So the first paper I'm going to talk about is Itai Ashwagi's paper and Peng Shi's paper, who they're not MIT anymore. They've both fled to California. However, they really kind of, I think, published here the first mechanism of design, like really bringing this mechanism of design for school choice to the operations space in a really interesting and important way. So their setting was that under school choice policies, there's two preferences that are taken into account. There's school preferences for children, which are mostly just around if there's a sibling in the school already, they get preference, but mostly it's family preferences for schools, the school choice idea. And there's a centralized assignment algorithm. They look at Boston that considers these preferences and randomly breaks ties when preferences are similar. And so the problem is that when there's a pure choice assignment model across Boston, neighborhoods are really disrupted by them. This on one block, students can attend dozens of schools. And that's actually what the mayor said. They quote this, they have this quote in this paper. The mayor said in 2012, pick any street, a dozen children probably attend a dozen different schools. Parents might not know each other, children might not play together, they can't carpool or study for the same test. We won't have the schools our kids deserve until we build school communities that serve them well. So essentially, the recognition around this time was that school choice trades off with this idea of community and neighborhood. And this, I should say that this is not something that Itai and Pang came to know just from this quote. Pang talks a lot about visiting community meetings weekly, monthly, to hear from parents and the school district about what kind of issues are present. And this community issue was a major, major sticking point, which is what motivated them to study this problem. So the insight of their manuscript is essentially that most of the community dispersion that they find is a little bit artificial, right? It's caused by this tie-breaking mechanism in the current lottery. And what they could do is take the original assignment probabilities and not make them any worse. But if you could think about community cohesion as something that the tie-breaking mechanism prioritizes, then you could increase the expected number of same community peers that a student would see at their assigned school. So basically ensure that more students from the same block attend the same school just by reconfiguring the tie-breaking mechanism. And when they applied this to historical data in the Boston Public Schools to show how it would work, they did show that for new families, which is the one that has the most control, because like I said, siblings get preference and you don't have a lot of control over those admissions. For new families, you see a very significant improvement in the number of same community peers assigned to these choice schools that are outside of the walk zone. And so their paper has, sort of motivated several papers in this area and mechanism design for school choice. But one of the most recent ones that I think is an interesting complement to the first one, which is why I wanted to talk about it, is one that looks at choice at the high school level, which has some interesting different dynamics. And so in this paper is by a different Itai Feigenbaum, Yash Kanoria, Irene Lowe, and Jay Sathamuraran. And this is about thinking about what's going on when choice allocations are not always taken up. And how do you deal with the fact that some students choose an alternative? So in New York City, which is their setting, most families submit choices for their high schools, but they do so early on in 8th grade. And then based on the choice assignment, they sometimes elect to send their child to a different school, or maybe not based on the choice assignment, but ultimately some percentage of students don't follow through with the choice that they were assigned. And so there's basically become a bunch of open spots. And so there's a second round of things going on. And then the problem is, how do you figure out how to reassign these spots? And the current approach in this is a waitlist system. But this creates cascades of reassignment where, as students get let in at one school, that means that the other school that that student was assigned to now has an open spot, and then that has to be filled, et cetera, et cetera. And this is costly. It can take congestion, lag, and it's inefficient. So they look at how to deal with this. And their insight is, again, by changing the tie-breaking decisions are made, they find that you can that you can make it more efficient without reducing welfare by essentially in the second round reversing the assignment. So it's, instead of sequentially moving students here, like student 6 to student 5 spot, student 5 to student 4 spot, et cetera, when student 1 leaves the system, you do the reverse lottery, which is move student 6 to students 1 spot. Student 6, for equivalent preferences here, student 6 got kind of the short straw in the first round, but in the second round kind of leaps up, and it makes it a lot more efficient without reducing welfare. And when they apply this to historical data in the New York City Department of Education, you can see here that this RLDA, the reverse mechanism, requires far fewer reassignments than the forward algorithm. And this x-axis is a metric of how reverse, basically, or how forward the algorithm is, how much permutation is happening. And so you can see, I mean, a difference between 8,000 essentially and 3,000 roughly is a big difference. And this just makes the reassignment process much more efficient. And so those two are the areas of mechanism design. The second area I'm going to talk about is district level support tools. And so this area of research comes from the market reforms, because market reforms actually make some of the original OR problems far more complex. Because, and this paper captures this perfectly, because it looks at the transportation issues essentially that are created when you give so much choice. And so Boston, their setting here, is unique amongst cities in that it provides a full choice system and transportation and busing. So like, for example, Chicago has choice, however, there's no free transportation. And so parents are constrained in some way, like they don't want to send their kid all the way across the city because they don't get a free bus ride every day to do that. And so this is Dimitri Bertsina's paper with Arthur De La Rue and Sebastian Martin's paper. And they were really involved with Boston, working very, very closely with the district to try to figure out how to think about this transportation monster that has been created when choice started happening and the costs just started for transporting students started ballooning. And so what they realized was that transportation costs are closely tied to school start times. So if you think about transportation costs as the number of buses that you have, which is the most costly thing that you can have, you can use fewer buses if you're able to reuse the bus for an early start school and a later start school on the same day. And then they took advantage of some education research that showed that student learning has shown that later school start times for high school students improves outcomes. So there's this motivation to actually, like a education-related motivation, not just an operational one, to move high school start times later in the day. And Seattle was doing this, I think, at the time. And this provided an opportunity to both sort of address an educational problem as well as an operational one. And so what they did is they came up with a process for jointly optimizing the start times of schools and the routes. And they essentially created multiple routing scenarios for a single school. And then in the second round, looked at how to match those routes across schools to minimize the total number of buses. So this lays it out. And nicely, this is a snapshot from their paper where they talk about making multiple scenarios in the first element. And then once they have those multiple scenarios for each school, selecting scenarios that sort of connect once they're done with one school, the bus can then travel to the next school and complete that second route. And so what they found essentially was that balancing the start times across these different 7:30, 8:30, and 9:30 a.m. starts was optimal, right? This was optimal in terms of bus routes and number of students, and it was the ideal scenario, and also one that also accommodated the fact that if high school started later, you could also achieve some other social learning goals as well, okay? However, the interesting part became where they realized that the current start times were perfectly essentially correlated with the median household income of the district in Boston, where higher income districts had later start times. So this is an example where parents at higher income schools are advocating for their children in the district and demanding later start times, and they were able to get it in a way that parents at low income schools and low income neighborhoods were not able to get. So they were the ones that had those earlier start times. And so what happened is that there was a routing and preference trade-off. So parents preferred the later start times, but you needed a distribution of early, middle, and late start times in order to achieve the optimal bus routing. And so because parents were so upset with the idea of getting an early start time, the authors Dimitri, Arthur, and Sebastian came up with a district level support tool to help the district manage this like combination of social and operational issues that were coming to a head. So on the x-axis here is the parent preferences for start times, or sorry, it's the parent preference, what percentage of the parent preferences for start times they can accommodate, and then the number of buses needed, and it captures the trade-off, essentially, right? So it shows the district what it costs, essentially, to accommodate a higher percentage of preferences of parents. And so this helped communicate the trade-offs to not only the district people, but also to citizens and parents who were confused about the policy and felt like they were the losers, and they didn't understand the broader effects of the policy on the district. And then the last area that I want to talk about is the school service contracts. So this is shifting things to the school level. So the first two areas are mostly at the district level in terms of the problems and operational issues that district faces. This is a study that's done by myself, Karen, and Paul Leonardi that looks at the school level. And this is important because there's school stuff going on with choice as well, where schools are now competing for students. And if school is the level at which, the operational level at which competition happens, it's an interesting place to look at how they're managing that competition. And so the setting we look at are that schools are under pressure to increase or maintain high enrollment with minimal budgets. This is the post-recession reality for schools. And so what they've decided to do commonly is to have service relationships with nonprofits and public agencies to boost school services without high costs. This is a way to attract parents, advertise higher quality provision of services without having to spend more money, okay? The problem is this marketplace is really nascent. The nonprofits and public agencies are small, heterogeneous, and unfamiliar. And schools have to navigate this marketplace and figure out which relationships to pursue and which ones to avoid. And so what we did, because this is sort of a new phenomenon, we decided to focus on 3 neighborhoods in Chicago: Allen Point, Oakville, and Lund Park. These are pseudonyms. And we figured we wanted to select different levels of economic hardship. So Allen Point had low economic hardship, Lund Park had moderate and high hardship in Oakville, where HI indicates this index that Chicago creates for their districts or for their neighborhoods. And within each of these neighborhoods, we sampled 3 schools, a public, charter, and a Catholic school. And these 3 schools, we were interested in how each of them navigates this issue of trying to compete in this marketplace with heterogeneous nonprofits that are not necessarily trustworthy or reliable when they have very minimal power. The schools have very minimal power themselves. And so we conducted a qualitative study where we did interviews with teachers, parents, and principals about the different relationships with nonprofits, the different contracts essentially that they maintained. And we ended up with 106 contracts, so descriptions of exactly how they started, how they evolved over time, what types of obstacles were faced. We have examples where contracts have failed. We have examples where contracts we thought they wouldn't work, but then they did work, et cetera. And our insight was that there are really 2 types of partners in the marketplace. The first is intrinsically trustworthy partners. And so this idea of intrinsic trustworthiness is common in supply chain research and trustworthiness as well. It's the idea that this partner just has some attribute about them that makes them more likely to follow through as expected. The other types of partners are more contextually trustworthy. So these partners, these nonprofits, will follow through to some schools, but not others. And sometimes the conditions for these trustworthiness is ambiguous to schools. And so you'd think that maybe intrinsically trustworthy partners would be attractive to schools and contextually trustworthy partners would not be. But we don't really find that. We find that people in schools do work with contextually trustworthy partners, but they start small. They start with low-scale projects and services, and they increase the scale over time if the partner proves trustworthy. And we believe that this is happening because schools are in such a powerless position in some way, or desperate position for resources, that if they could only rely on intrinsically trustworthy partners, that might be ideal. But because of the pressures that they're under, they're willing to engage with these contextually trustworthy partners to start and see where it goes. And so across our 106 partner relationships, we find that about 50% of them are with intrinsically trustworthy partners, that the schools start out with high stakes relationships. They're willing to engage in a full after school program with this partner right out of the gate. In another 32% of cases, They start big with these partners, these contextually trustworthy partners, and sometimes that works out great. And then sometimes this arrow downward indicates that they start with these high value relationships, and then they end up having to shift completely, redo the relationship with somebody else, or just bail entirely. And then 19% of the relationships, schools were very wary of the partner to begin with. And so they started with a very small, like a one-day type of project or resource. And then from there, if the partner proved trustworthy and followed through, they increased their reliance on the partner. Otherwise, they just kept it as small or nothing at all. And so overall, there was these three buckets of market research that has been done since these reforms have taken place: the mechanism designed for school choice, district level support tools, and school service contracts. And so these are sort of emerging areas that have arisen because of these changes to competition, performance, enrollment issues in districts and schools. And I wanted to end by talking about some commonalities amongst these three areas. They are applying standard OR/OM ideas to the education setting, whether it's transportation, lotteries, or contracts. They're all studying social issues, equity, trust, community cohesion, student well-being, together with operational decision-making. And I think that these social issues have become sort of, you can't study some of the problems or operational problems in education without tackling these social issues as well. They're impossible to disentangle. And then they've all had maintained working relationships with districts and schools, right? People have been attending community meetings like Peng Shi, been interviewing, teachers have been working closely with the district to get data. Whatever it is, they are not working in isolation. And I want to mention some opportunities here for future research, because I think that these studies highlight this movement in a new area that I think provides some exciting opportunities. So the first one is to combine other OR/OM contexts with education. So rather than expand the types of like transportation, lotteries, and contracts more, we can move in a different direction with healthcare and sustainability, for example. So I think that especially with COVID, the relationship between healthcare and education has become especially visible. And I think that we have underappreciated as operations people how much healthcare is actually happening in schools, whether it's getting shots and vaccines and flu shots, eye exams, and also there was one other example I was going to think of. I forget. Anyway, there's a lot of healthcare happening in schools. Oh, and then meals. That was the last one. Like students are getting fed at school, especially in low-income schools. So all of these things contribute to their physical well-being. There's also the issue of things that are happening in sustainability. So for example, school closures have been happening before COVID because of environmental problems, whether it's fires or hurricanes. As climate change becomes more of an issue, this is going to become a problem in education where school closures are not just a rare event, but I think something that's going to be happening frequently. You have to figure out what the implications of that is and how to manage it effectively. The other thing related to social issues is that although we have been expanding further and further and accepting more and more social issues into our operational decision-making approaches, things that we still need to talk more about that have been here since the beginning in our research that Karen has talked about, but are, they're still here and we need to engage with them more, I think, in the wake of market reforms, which is segregation, racial segregation, income segregation, et cetera, especially in the United States. And then I think in addition to the working relationships that we have with districts and schools, I think we can push ourselves further to conduct field experiments or actual implementation in practice to make it so that we're seen more as an integral partner, make sure every district and school understands education operations. I think we have more work to do there to make sure that they see us as partners in this and not outsiders that are coming in. So thank you very much for this brief overview of this area of research. And I look forward to hearing your comments, questions. Feel free to email me as well if you don't get the opportunity to talk to me as part of this tutorial. Thank you very much, and I will hope you have a great day. Well, thank you for sticking with us this long in our online virtual tutorial. So we're really looking forward to this last part where we can kind of go beyond. So we were writing the tutorial when COVID happened. And so we were able to incorporate a little bit about COVID in the tutorial during the revision process, but we didn't really, obviously a lot has played out in the past 4 or 5 months. And so we just want to take this time to kind of reflect a little bit on some similarities across Karen and my part of the presentation, and then talk a little about COVID and how people can get involved in this type of research if you haven't been involved so far. So one of the things, I'll just start off, one of the things that was really interesting when I was listening to Karen's presentation was about how, well, I mean, just more generally about how policy reforms have stemmed from the court. This is something that I, at least in my research horizon, haven't really experienced, these big court decisions that have influenced policy. It's mostly been market reforms, and also how much the OR and OM community was engaged in like really tough topics like race, which I think the new market reforms research, we haven't really engaged with it the way that has been done in the past. And I think that's an interesting and cool opportunity. I think that we have this history and maybe we should return to it.
And you think of some of, I'm thinking in the Informs Connect, some of the discussions Chris Tang, for example, has started about really bringing up important issues. And then you look back in the 70s at some of the papers that were in management science, and it's, you know,
they're like
I
fighting.
hope that we're returning. Yeah, I think we're returning there.
Yeah, like having really hard conversations.
Yep. And you see it reflected, you know, there's the early papers talk a lot about neighborhoods, and then you see Ashlagi and she come back to the issue of how do we make sure as we're doing mechanism design, we're thinking about neighborhood cohesion. And, you know, it struck me when you were talking about, you look on any block, or, you know, the quote from their paper, you look on any block and how many different schools the kids go to. And that's something we're wrestling with right now in Evanston with COVID. It's a lot of these similar issues.
Yeah, and one of the things that, you know, one of the issues of the transition from like everyone in the same neighborhood attends the same school to everyone in the neighborhood attends very, very different schools, as is common in most big cities now, is that with COVID, there's these pods popping up. There, people are trying to find these alternative ways to support kids so they can get together at home. But if they're all attending different schools, then they can't all sit together and do their 4th grade work because they're all logging into different schools. So it's been really, I think, disruptive to this choice idea, or this maybe kind of made us even more reflective about maybe neighborhoods are, you have to keep them intact for, especially when school closures happen or something like this, they serve an important purpose.
That's a great point. And think about the burden on transportation, right? And so if we're taking schools out of neighborhoods and we're putting students on buses, what happens when we have to drastically reduce the capacity of the buses for
Right.
safe social distancing? It's a big issue. You know, I think back, you know, you were mentioning we were writing this case in March, and one of the things that was happening in March is reporters were reaching out to me because they wanted to talk about the school lunch program, something that a lot of people didn't know about. And I think that COVID really opened their eyes to all of the services that schools provide, and that to a lot of people it was news that families were getting their meals from schools. And I think back to that Konigsberg quote about, you know, if schools continue to bear the brunt of integration, well, isn't that some of the issues schools are wrestling with right now, of bearing the brunt of returning kids to schools so parents can work? Our public schools are so integral to so much, and we're putting so much burden on the schools to do all of this. And so the question is, you know, how do we as researchers help in this?
Yeah. And I think that was, one of the big takeaways from a lot of like in the news about COVID in schools was, I guess, schools, I guess, are our safety net. Like if we think about the safety net, this is like something that's providing a ton. And I think, you know, it's not just lunches, they're getting breakfast and lunch often, and they're getting snacks typically provided to them in many schools. And I think it's important to highlight the numbers here, where I think my last checked, 51% of US public school students are eligible for the free or reduced price lunch program. So it's more than half of public school students. And 20% of children in the United States, or I think a little bit under 20%, 16 to 20% are in poverty. So they're actually at the poverty line or lower. So this is not a rare thing. And it's not just a problem that's happening elsewhere, right? It's happening in our schools. And so this is a really complicated problem. Schools are relied on for so much. as part of the study that we did, schools are talking about providing dental care or flu shots at school. I mean, they're providing so much of these things, and when they're closed, it becomes kind of shocking what things don't get provided. So it's kind of interesting, different perspective on schooling. It's not just providing the education piece, really. It's doing much more.
And I think that one of the things that we can do is provide the data support, the data visualization to really help tell the story. And you were talking about the MIT study, and one of the neat things that came out of their work was a project they did with the Boston Globe, where they started really visualizing equity. And it was really neat to see the way they use data and data visualization to communicate what was going on, because these are not subjects without controversy. And, you could talk to that group a lot about what they experienced. And I think a big part of that is being able to communicate through data, and I can say this as both a researcher and as a parent. You tend to approach schools through your children's school. And if we're going to continue to make the big changes that are needed to public schools, how do we get people to think more broadly? And I think that data plays a big role in all of this. You think back to the Koenigsberg and Franklin work with the Richmond public schools, and being able to show that, yes, there is a feasible solution, and we can do this. And that, I think sometimes we focus so much on finding the optimal solution, but sometimes just showing what the problem is and starting to do a roadmap to solutions is really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about that right now. I mean, for all of us that are maybe newly interested in this problem or feel like they are motivated to get involved more because of COVID, or feel like there's like this opportunity here. I think what you're pointing out is basically that districts are in crisis, right? They're in panic mode. They're facing tremendous budget cuts, and they just don't know how to reopen their schools successfully with this new, like, a lot of districts are closed, not because the knowledge doesn't exist out there in the world, but it's not in the district themselves, and there's not enough resources, I think, to support what they need to do. And so we have a part in our tutorial about how to get involved with this type of work. And so, because I think it can feel intimidating to, reach out to a school district or something like that, but there's some good tips that we can highlight, a couple of them here, about how that can be done in a way that doesn't feel as overwhelming.
I think that's a great point. And one of the best practices that we highlight in the tutorial is what Northwestern has done with OSEP, which is we've created a central way for faculty and researchers to work with public schools in Evanston, the Chicago public schools as well, because what we don't want to do, like you said, is overwhelm the schools, right? You don't want every faculty member saying, I'm here to solve all your problems, because A, we don't know what their problems are, we don't know how to solve their problems, and they're in crisis and they don't need us flooding them. And so, look to your school of education, your school of education and social policy, and see what are ways to make inroads. What are ways to look at where they need help. And one of the things is approach it with humility. Some of the work, we have long-term plans that are similar to some of the projects we're working on, but sometimes right now it really is just helping them with data processing and some analysis, really helping them with the crisis at hand.
Yeah, and you can think long-term about it, where maybe at the start you could do a project for your class that you're teaching, get your students involved with the schools. Something that's maybe a little more, if it's visualization or some basic analytics stuff, that could be huge opportunity to build some trust with the district. But it's not something that you're trying to engage in like a full-scale research project, long run, right out of the gate. So you can sort of start small with the district as one way to do it.
And then the other similar to the work that you did, right? So this work on building trustworthiness, right? Start small.
Yeah. That's right. It's like, use the same logic of the schools are probably going to be wary, or the districts too, of what your motives are. And I mean, I think they're dealing with a lot. And so it's a good opportunity to just start with a low stakes interaction and go from there. And if that does still, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think, the Nice White Parents podcast that I alluded to in my part, sometimes we do need to step back and even think about our motives. We may think that our motives are what's best for the district, and sometimes they're not.
Yes, and I think that was something that I think I feel like, at least the papers that I've talked about, in the market reforms. And I think this was true long before. But I think there's a lot of good examples of really good relationships with districts, or waiting to hear, like Ping Shi sitting in the Boston schools community meetings and thinking of community cohesion that way. Not, community cohesion wasn't something that they figured out by sitting in their offices. They had to like hear on the streets of like what's going on and what problems need to be solved. So I think, approaching it with that, you're right, is like the best approach. And I think I'll just say quickly at the end here that, there's other opportunities to do research and education operations besides working with districts. There's lots of companies, there's ed tech companies that are especially happening, growing tremendously right now in the K-12 space. We know MOOCs or we know Coursera, but in the K-12 space, there's tons of opportunities. There's marketplaces, online marketplaces like Teachers Pay Teachers, where they post their content and curriculum and the teachers buy it from each other. There's Google Classroom. There's this technology called Nearpod, which teachers can use to monitor student work remotely and see what they're doing on their screens. Seesaw is another one. Khan Academy. I mean, all of these companies are smaller, maybe feeling a little more familiar to the operations community, and they might be more familiar with what we do as well. So these are ways where you could get your feet wet as well if you feel like you were interested in education operations, but maybe aren't, confident in a full-fledged district partnership right out of the gate.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So I think at this point we should probably open it up to the Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you all for sticking with us for all this time, and we are looking forward to answering questions and continuing the conversation. We have a fantastic public school system, and again, we're talking very much about the U.S., but maybe also in the Q&A is an opportunity for us to talk more broadly and to talk about some of the papers we discuss in the tutorial that are happening in other countries as well. Great.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.